The woods are the kind of place that swallows sound. When you stand in the middle of them, the silence feels heavy pressing against our chest, like the forest itself is holding its breath. I grew up inside that silence. My family's house stood far from the city, far from neighbors, tucked into the shadows of tall, ancient trees. It wasn't just any house. It was my grandmother's, passed down after her death. The walls carried the smell of old wood and faint traces of mothballs, and sometimes, when the wind pressed hard against the shutters, I swore I could still hear her rocking chair creak upstairs. My grandmother was an odd woman. People in the nearby town spoke of her in hushed tones, shaking their heads when they thought no one could hear. She had a peculiar habit that made children nervous and adults uneasy. Every evening, without fail, she would step outside with a bowl of scraps, meat bones, bits of bread, even shiny trinkets, and scatter them across the yard. Within minutes, the sky would darken with the beating of black wings. Ravens, dozens of them, sometimes more. They perched on the roof, the fence, and the branches of trees that bent toward the house like eager listeners. They cawed and croaked, a choir of harsh voices, and my grandmother would stand among them, murmuring as though in conversation. When I was little, it seemed strange but not frightening. Children accept the world as it is given to them. My grandmother fed the ravens came, and that was that. But years later, with her buried and the house I live in, I started to see the habit differently. What had once been a family quirk carried an edge of unease. It began with the eyes. I would step outside in the evenings, just as she had, and the birds would be waiting. Their black feathers gleamed in the dying light, their heads cocked in eerie unison, as if one thought bound them all. When I moved, their eyes followed, always watching, always waiting. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. They were just birds, creatures of instinct drawn to the promise of food. But as the nights grew colder and the woods stretched darker around me, I noticed something else. Their caws, once random and wild, began to feel patterned. Their calls rose and fell with a strange cadence, like broken fragments of words. And sometimes when I stood too close, I swore I heard whispers, low, rasping, slipping beneath my skin. Emily. The first time I heard my name, I froze. The sound came from just over my shoulder, close enough that I felt breath on my ear. But when I turned, no one was there. Only the ravens, clustered together, their heads tilting in perfect synchrony. My heart hammered. I ran back inside, slamming the door, but the sound followed me. Muffled, persistent, like voices speaking just beyond the walls. That was when I realized the whispers didn't stop at the edge of the yard. They followed me inside. The days that followed blurred into a haze of unease. I stopped feeding the birds, hoping they would scatter, but the ravens didn't leave. They lined the fence like sentries. They waited on the roof, claws scraping against the shingles. At night, they perched on the windowsill, their black eyes peering in through the glass. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, the whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. They spoke my name over and over, sometimes stretching it into a hiss. Sometimes it was a laugh, sharp and humorless. And sometimes it was something else. A voice I didn't recognize, deeper and darker, curling around my thoughts like smoke. I started avoiding the upstairs bedroom, the one that had belonged to my grandmother. Something about it made the whispers louder, as though the walls themselves carried sound. When I stood in the doorway, I could smell her perfume, faint and powdery, mixing with something else, something foul like rot hidden beneath the floorboards. I told myself I was losing my mind. Isolation does things to people. Living so far from the city, with no one to talk to, no one to ground me in reality, it was easy to imagine things. But then came a night when the whisper spoke not just my name, but a sentence.
She let me in.
My blood turned to ice. I bolted upright in bed, every muscle trembling. The voice hadn't come from outside. It hadn't come from the birds. It had come from the dark corner of my room. What followed were nights of terror. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. Doors creaked open on their own. Objects shifted places when I wasn't looking. And always the ravens were there, watching, waiting, whispering. But by then, I wasn't sure the whispers belonged to them at all. I began searching the house, desperate for answers. I went through my grandmother's belongings, opening boxes that hadn't been touched in years. Old letters, photographs, journals. In one of those journals, I found it, an entry written in a shaky hand. September 12th. They come to me every night now. Not the birds, no. Never the birds. They are only the messengers. The voice behind them is older, darker. I thought I could keep it at bay with offerings. I was wrong. It does not want food. It wants something else. Maybe a scar between realities, and it knows where to find it. My grandmother had been feeding the ravens not to nourish them, but to distract something else, something she had tried and failed to keep contained. The realization came too late. That night, I woke to find my bedroom window wide open. The ravens were gone. Not a single one perched outside. For the first time in weeks, the yard was empty. Silent. That was when I heard it.
Emily.
Not a whisper this time, but a voice. Clear, cold, crawling out of the darkness. You've heard me all along. My breath caught. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body refused to move. The shadows in the corner thickened, stretching, rising. Something stepped forward, something not bound by shape or light. It bent toward me, and though it had no face, no eyes, I felt its gaze burrow into me. The ravens had never spoken to me. They had only carried the weight of something else, an entity that had been waiting, biding its time, until I was old enough, alone enough, weak enough, and now it had found its door. From that night on, I was never seen in town again. The house still stands, swallowed by trees and silence. Locals say the ravens gather there at dusk, lining the roof and fence, just as they did before. They say if you stand close enough, you can hear whispers in the dark. Not the birds, never the birds, something else. The truth of what happened only came out much later. It wasn't the police who first discovered it. The house was too far for neighbors, too deep in the woods for anyone nearby to notice. Most people avoided the place entirely. But one summer, a small group of hikers, tourists from out of state, decided to explore the forest trails. They weren't looking for the house. They stumbled across it by accident. They said later that the place felt wrong the moment they saw it. The windows were dark, the air heavy with silence, and yet the yard was alive with black feathers. Ravens perched on the roof and fence, watching in a way that made them uneasy. The hikers only meant to look around, maybe take a few pictures. But when they stepped behind the house, they found something stranger. The earth had sunk in patches, leaving a hollow in the ground. Curious, they got closer, thinking maybe it was an old well or a root cellar. But as they brushed away the dirt, stones appeared. Not random stones, but a ring, perfectly shaped, set into the ground. They reported it to the sheriff when they got back to town. At first, he thought nothing of it. But when deputies arrived, they saw the same thing. A circle of stones, carved faintly with marks that didn't look natural. Against their better judgment, they lifted one. Cold air rushed out, colder than the evening around them, and it carried with it a smell that made every man present gag. A mix of rust, ash, and something long dead. Inside was a hidden chamber. Bones, feathers, burned would carve into bird shapes, all scattered like offerings. And in the middle was a small broken box. Inside were scraps of paper, stained and nearly falling apart, with something written on them.
It says, "They are only the messengers. The true voice waits below."
The police didn't understand it. At first, they thought it was the rambling of an old woman. But when county workers looked into old land records, they found something unsettling. Those stones hadn't always been there. Decades ago, they had been taken from another site deeper in the forest, moved without reason, without care. That was the mistake. The stones had been part of something older, something meant to stay sealed. When they were moved, the seal was broken. My grandmother had lived with the burden of it, tried to keep it quiet the only way she knew how. Feeding the ravens, distracting them, hoping the voice would stay buried. But doors don't stay closed once they've been opened. The county filed reports. They used words like archaeological site and unidentified remains. But their papers didn't explain why the deputies swore they heard whispers in the woods. They didn't explain why the hikers refused to go near the house again, claiming they still felt eyes watching them even in their sleep. The truth is simpler. It never wanted food. It wanted a door. And the door was opened.